Hey, welcome to the channel. We hope that you enjoy today's stories and check out the chapters on the video to see all the stories for today. But before we get into this video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to get notified when we release a new video. So let's get into the video.
What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you?
Experience 1. The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and I had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad had been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her via DM and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a crappy secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Experience 2. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one. But not for another. I was adopted and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her to marry a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went, into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory. And was R-worded by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. The endings to our search are not always happy. Experience 3. She was my best friend of 7 years, we had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her, after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said screw it, let's go back, she's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited, she was over almost every night for dinner, and we all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and me against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan before us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him, she just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she, well, cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. My husband and I are great now, by the way. Experience 4. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was R-worded by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the promiscuous woman of the family. My dad's side is garbage.
Do you like listening to these stories? Do you want to hear more of them? Then click that like button, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. And check the description for links to more videos and interesting stories.
Experience 5. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO of a major health fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the Heath Fund role were largely built on fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on these claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. Experience 6. The reason Grandma moved away, when my dad was still a baby, to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost killed him. It was a very small village. Later she told me he was a person who committed R-word. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with "I did the right thing." We never met her side of the family. Experience 7. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5 for context. One day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was doing a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the intercourse offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Experience 8. When I was 17, I dated someone who told me when he was drunk that not only would he probably hit me one day, and just wanted me to be prepared, but he also used to R-word his little brother. Every now and then I remember that moment and it just floors me how dangerous that kid was. Experience 9. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano for sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards/money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Screw you, Emily. Experience 10. An uncle beat a guy almost to death with his bare hands. He had walked in on a friend assaulting a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind, so it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. Experience 11. My former church youth pastor was committing R-word on an acquaintance of mine for years and inadvertently caused his death. I met this boy and the youth pastor when I was in middle school. The boy was gay, and it was pretty well known. He was not a regular member of the church, just occasional teen group activities. The first time I ever met the youth pastor, I asked a friend if he was gay. They told me I was crazy. Well, I wasn't. This man was beloved by everyone, and I mean loved. He was the youth leader for over a decade. The last time I ever saw the boy, we were about 16. I ran into him at a store. He told me what had been happening all these years and that he was finally strong enough to expose him. He told me that either he was going to make the youth pastor confess to the church or he would go to the police. As far as I know, he followed through with this confrontation because the very next week, the head pastor announced to the church that our youth pastor was quitting, moving back to his home state to go work at the grocery store he used to work at. Yes, a freaking grocery store. They threw him a farewell party. I never saw the boy again, but I do know he didn't get justice because the youth pastor did exactly what he told the church he was going to do. The boy went into a tailspin, as his cousin told me years later, was depressed and got hooked on drugs. He overdosed when we were 19. I have lived with this for years and kick myself for not saying something too. I don't know if I can now. If anyone thinks I can and something will be done, I do know where that youth pastor is now. Experience 12. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old, he was 55, she apparently aborted his baby, and everything he told me about his prior life was a lie, second marriage for both of us, and he had been having intercourse with men since he was in his early 20s. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together for 10 years and married for 6. Experience 13. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually, we became friends, and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Borland from Home Improvement, to give you an idea. Like 4 years later, I was looking at the intercourse offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of co-running a commercial child explicit video sales site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison. Experience 14. My brother was stealing money from his father who had dementia. This went on for a year, and then I found out about it because the bank who had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it, he said,
Well, I got to pay my bills.
I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure Shot got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that. My brother also stole some of my inheritance. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his dying father. Experience 15. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy. At family events such as weddings, etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper, no idea why, and I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor Prison. Went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80s for kidnapping and R-worded someone, and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1p by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time. However, from what I've gathered, he was released around 5 years ago.
We hope you enjoyed listening to today's stories. If you want to see more stories, check out these videos or check the links in the description for more videos. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And ring that notification bell.